Hi everyone, and welcome to the Flip Collaborate for Assessment 1A, the team analysis for literacy across the curriculum. Welcome everyone, both main unit students and those who are choosing to do their specialisation. My name's Rachel, if you haven't met me before, and we're going to be giving you some help today to get started with the team analysis part of your assessment. This also leads into assessment 1B, which is where you also relate to the same scenario, but you go a little bit more practical in AB and have a lot more suggestions about how you're going to perhaps teach these science outcomes with literacy embedded throughout your suggestions. If you are a specialisation student, so we have some videos up in the announcements if you're wondering if you should be doing specialisation or not. If you haven't done a math specialisation already and you have joined the course, any sort of education course during or after 2019, it's a possibility that you will need to do it. The student advisors are the best point of call for this. Your ELA or myself, we don't have access to your individual files or their enrolment information. So if you are concerned, please drop them an email or give them a call and they'll be able to tell you for sure whether you need to do it if you are worried. Now, you will also need to pair up with those who are also doing specialisation or also part of the main unit or normal assessment or other assessment, whatever we're going to call it, because they do have different rubrics, which I will show you at a point during this presentation today. So it's important that you join up specialisation people together and non-specialisation people together. So let's get started and have a look at this first assessment. So as a part of this assessment, we have a scenario. Now, for non-specialisation students, we have 1,000 words, and for specialisation students, you have 1,500 words. The criteria, as in what we need to do and what we need to cover, is exactly the same. So if you were wondering, do you have to add extra? Do you have extra points that you need to cover? No, you don't. You have exactly the same content. The only difference is the word count, because as a part of your rubric for specialisation, you're going to show us a few extra things. So you need those extra words to be able to show us that you can display expert pedagogical content knowledge and you can relate to high impact teaching strategies and things like that. So all of the slides moving forward are the same for everybody. So everyone needs to know this information. We have a scenario, which I'm not going to read all of this to you right now. You'll have a read yourself from the assessment details. But basically we have Sean, he's leading his team of grade 3 teachers and they're based at this particular school. It's a low socioeconomic background school. It's got high ESL and Indigenous students. So that's something to bear in mind for both this assessment and the next one. Now he has a science inquiry unit, so just be mindful of the term inquiry there. We have this inquiry unit and it's a science-based one. And basically what they're going to be teaching is a unit that I've done in primary school before is states of matter. So they're going to be having a look at solids, liquid, gases, and how they can be changed by either adding or removing heat. So you look at things like evaporation, you look at things like condensation, you look at things like atoms and, different states of charge and things like that. So we have a science concept that we need to teach. Now we know that when we're having a look at science and when we're having a look at many of the other subject areas, there's always obviously going to be literacy embedded throughout the unit. Although it's not going to be taught directly during this unit, kids are going to be using literacy all the time. They're going to be using different oral language elements like speaking to each other, having discussions, collaborating, in a more social aspect of science, having a look at experiments, discussing in groups, as well as reading of information. They might have to read Firstly, they have to be able to decode and comprehend a range of text, information text, procedural text perhaps, being able to decode information, being able to comprehend the information that they're given, being able to critically perhaps analyze some of the information, being able to understand particular bias or author's intent of the information that they're reading and they're getting on this particular topics. They're also going to have to be writing. They might have to write their own procedure. They might have to write their own science report. So there's going to be writing of their own too. So they're going to be using oral language skills, speaking and listening skills. They're going to be using reading, both decoding and comprehending skills, and they're going to be using their own writing skills. This is not a formal literacy lesson. We're not teaching the students to be able to do these things. This is the time where they show us how they can actually implement these things. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about both formal and informal literacy. So bearing all that in mind, Sean knows that after he's conducted his pre-test, that he realizes that some of the kids don't quite have the skills to be able to cope with what he has planned in this inquiry unit. So he's realized that some of their knowledge is very poor in this area. He is unsure of how to progress and is aware that some of the students' literacy levels are below the state benchmark. So the tricky thing often about science teaching is that there is a lot of very science-specific vocab, and that seems to trip a lot of kids up when they're reading, which makes comprehending difficult if they're exposed to a lot of new words. If you're doing some research in the area, you might also realize that ESL kids will also have issues with vocabulary development potentially, which then impacts on comprehension because of a lower vocab range as opposed to kids who have English as their first language. So Sean's in a bit of a predicament here. Sean and his team are in a bit of a predicament because they know that they must teach this inquiry unit. They know that they have to teach this particular content descriptor, the chemical science states of matter. But how are they going to support the kids? How are they going to support the kids to be able to conduct the science unit and achieve success in the science unit, but also nurturing them with their literacy skills so that they're able to find success in this science unit? So we have to imagine ourselves that we are Sean, we are leading a team, and how are we really going to be able to support Sean best meet the needs of the kids? So I have broken this down into a three-way task. This is not set in stone. This is just an example of how it could be done. If you would like to work on different parts with different people, you don't have to allocate one part to each person. Your team can work how it is best for you and how best you learn. So if you've only got 2 people, you'll obviously divide it up differently. If you've got the 3, you could use it this way. Completely up to you. But for an example, I'm going to divide, because there's pretty much 3 tasks that need to be done, I've divided it up into 3. I'm sure you'll figure it out with your terrific team. You will need to include an introduction, but I'm not going to talk about that here because I think between your team, you should be able to come up with a fairly decent introduction and conclusion. We're going to really just focus on the body and what needs to be covered. If you would like to ask some more questions about the introduction and conclusion, then you can ask me at the interactive collab. So, person A, or person 1, we'll just call them A. I was trying to be consistent across my slides. They are the first person up, and a majority of what they need to find is within the week 2 learning materials. However, particularly those who are doing specialization, the point of your task is to not only engage with the learning materials that have been given to you, but also to look further afield. So you should be conducting some of your own research as well. And it's always good practice to include a number of resources from the unit, as well as some of the things that you've found yourself. So person A is going to write they're going to do a description and a brief analysis of the expected literacy skills and needs relevant to the scenario as detailed in the Australian curriculum. So they're going to give a bit of an overview on what's happening in the scenario, and then they're going to make strong connections to the curriculum and other relevant documents. We'll talk about that over the next few slides. Person B's job, primarily in the week 3 content, but again, you're going to be looking further afield, is to analyse the 3D model, so Green's 3D model, which connects to the 3 literacy dimensions of operational, cultural, and critical. And then they're going to connect that back to the scenario. And then person C's job is to have a look at the week 1 content and read further afield to provide an explanation of formal and informal literacy learning. And then you're going to be connecting that back to Sean and the scenario. So let's have a look at person A and see exactly what they need to do. Now, person A, you are going to connect to the curriculum to help Sean and his team to figure out what elements of literacy really need to be embedded within their inquiry planning. Now, we're not just looking at literacy as a whole area. So if this was our literacy lesson, if this was our reading lesson, we would go to the English outcomes. And if this was a formal literacy approach, we would use something like modelled reading or shared reading or guided reading to implement some sort of literacy program. However, this is our science learning, this is our inquiry time. So we need to be able to, and I'm just going to pause my slides there just for a second so I can go to my web browser, because we're going to bring up the Australian curriculum. It's person A's job, as well as being supported by the other team members, to have a look at the Australian curriculum, have a look at science. If you click on level 3 and click submit, you should bring up your level 3 content descriptors. And when you click on science understanding, it's the second one down called, states, change of state between solids and liquids. If we click on elaborations, which brings down this drop box, you'll notice that there are quite a number of these little symbols around it. If you click on this one that looks, I don't know if it's supposed to be like a little notepad or a little book, but when you hover over it, you can see that it says literacy. So as a part of our elaboration, so our elaborations always being from the content descriptor, you have your elaborations that help you to get a bit more of a detailed view on what the content descriptor is asking you, which can be super helpful as a teacher, because sometimes when you're reading a content descriptor, it can be really hard to decipher exactly what they mean. So the elaborations obviously elaborate on what is being said there. If we go down to exploring how changes from a solid to a liquid and liquid to a solid can help us recycle materials, and we click on literacy, we are connected to elements of word knowledge and comprehending text through listening, reading, and viewing. If I go back to my slides for a moment and have a look back at this diagram here, we can see that when literacy is used as a general capability, we have literacy in the middle. And what does that mean exactly? Well, that just means that literacy is not our primary focus. It is a subsequent focus. We are using literacy as a part of something else, which in a primary school is most likely going to be, say, inquiry or ICT or some other way. It's not a formal literacy lesson. When literacy is not a formal literacy lesson, but we're still using it and we're still practicing the skills informally, we have literacy in the middle of this diagram here. And we cover these elements of literacy. We cover grammar knowledge, we cover text knowledge, we cover word knowledge, and we cover visual knowledge. If you would like to know more about these elements, if you go into the Australian curriculum and type in this general capabilities section and click on literacy, oops, didn't mean to click on that, it will take you to an overview of each of these. So when we have a look at grammar knowledge and text knowledge, it's really connecting to things that you're going to see, say, in the 3D model, where you have things like your operational area of that 3D knowledge is really focusing on the grammar. It's looking at the construct of text and how you put text together to be able to read them, to be able to decode them, to be able to have some sort of understanding of the grammar, of the structure of language that makes sense. So you come to a text with your understanding of grammar, and that literacy and language, have a certain process to them, have a sort of formula to them. That's going to help you. Your ability to be able to decode and understand language helps you to be able to comprehend your text. You will also come to a text with some sort of text knowledge. If we use our science ideas as an example, you might have a science, like a science experiment overview of steps that you need to follow to be able to complete an experiment. And kids will come to that with some sort of text knowledge. They'll be familiar with procedural text. They'll be familiar with, say, informational text. So kids are going to come, as particularly in a grade 3 classroom, they're going to come to the text with some sort of text knowledge that's going to help aid comprehension as well. So over here we've got more of our grammar and decoding part of the pie, which helps us to comprehend text. We come to the text with some sort of text level knowledge about the structure and features of text. On this side, we come with word knowledge. Now, word knowledge is going to be very important in a science unit because we have so much scientific specific vocab. When we think about states of matter, there could be words in there that the kids are not going to know or not be familiar with, particularly if they're from an ESL background. So we have word knowledge, thinking about vocab. We also have visual clues that we're going to use to be able to create our knowledge of literacy. Literacy is very much multimodal, and it comes to us through many different aspects. And if kids are researching about states of matter and wanting to find out more, they could be getting information from diagrams. Think about science programs and science books. They're going to be charts and they're going to be diagrams. There could be annotated diagrams. There could be videos. There could be images. There could be text. So visual knowledge is going to be very varied in a unit like this, in a science unit like this. So when kids can decode, when they come to the text with a sort of level of knowledge, when they can have some grasp on the vocab and also have different elements of visuals, that comes together to make that piece together and form a strong concept of literacy. If I go back to the Australian curriculum here, you will see that from that pie, we have word knowledge because there is a lot of of specific language dedicated to science, understanding, learning area vocab. And also we need the kids to be able to comprehend what it is that they're reading. So through listening, very much related to multimodal learning through the auditory, reading and viewing. They're going to be able to interpret and analyze learning area texts, navigate, read and view learning area text. Thinking about that word navigate, you can see that there could be a lot of perhaps websites that kids need to scroll through, and they need to be able to think critically about what they're reading, which also gives you a clue with that 3D model. If we click on predicting, we also have word knowledge, and we also have the ability to compose written and multimodal texts. So it's not just a matter of the kids being able to navigate them in a sense of reading them and deciphering them and comprehending them. They must also then be able to produce their own text in much a similar way. So what does that mean for our assessment? Let's have another look. So person A's job would be to have a look at the general capabilities and become very familiar with them, have a look at that content descriptor and become familiar with the literacy elements behind that particular content descriptor. I've given you a slide here of the things that I just went to in the curriculum. So just to remind you, but we don't need to have a look at that again, but that's the word knowledge that we were just talking about. So person A, what do you need to do? As well as giving a bit of an overview into the scenario, you're also going to talk about which documents could be supportive. Now, this is thinking really early on in the planning. You have to imagine yourself as Sean and the team sitting down together. There is no planning of activities yet. There is no suggesting of things that the kids are going to do. This is really, really early stage stuff. This is us as teachers gathering our information together, gathering our support documents together, so that once we have all these things in order and we know what it is we need to teach and how we're going to do it, later on we can start thinking about what activities would be best suited. We are not planning activities for this assignment. That is for assessment 1B. So what documents could be supportive? What things we have to imagine ourselves like we're Sean at the table and we're sitting down. What things could the team gather? What documents could they gather that could be helpful? And they could put in front of them and help them perhaps replan the unit or make changes to the unit. These documents might give them some insight. In the assessment details, apologies again, I've just clicked on the slide and I made it disappear. In the assessment details, it talks about teaching and learning cycle. We'll talk more about that at the interactive collab, but they could have a look at that teaching and learning cycle and figure out the process of teaching and learning and how we are going to make adjustments to our teaching to make sure that we're catering to all different learning areas in terms of differentiation. You're going to look at literacy as a general capability, which we just did together. These are just suggestions. You could come up with your own. Perhaps you do look at the literacy scope and sequence and see if there are any other connections that you could make. We've already made connections to procedural writing and information text and comprehending and viewing, but is there anything else that could be a document that the teachers could have on the table to refer to? We do have quite a number of kids who are ESL or AEL or have who are Indigenous. So how can we help to cater to them? Are there any documents? Is there anything else in the Australian curriculum that could help? In the Victorian curriculum, there is an EAL subsequent English and literacy documentation. So does that help? These are just suggestions, by the way. You don't have to give an in-depth overview on how you're going to use them. You probably don't want them to read like a list though. So if you are going to make a suggestion of using information from the literacy toolkit, you could explain how you are going to use it rather than just making a list like this of all the different documents. Even at level 3, the literacy rationale, aims and overview for level 3 are quite helpful. The literacy toolkit has lots of information, but also just look at the department website and see if there are any other supportive documents that could be used to help assist with planning. Again, it's not about planning activities, it's just about any documents that could be supportive of what Sean is trying to do. All right, so person B is going to focus on Green's 3D model. Now, I apologize that this writing is a little bit small, but you do have the link to the Teaching Literacy Toolkit website here, and that will bring you straight up to this document so that you will be able to see it much more clearer. Person B, the first thing you're going to do is that you need to define 3D model. So that's going to be your first job, and that is going to take up a fair bit of your word count because you'll need to go through the operational dimension, the cultural dimension, and the critical dimension. I really like the Literacy Toolkit because it keeps everything just really straightforward and a lot less jargony than perhaps other websites and documents. So this aligns very closely to the 4 resources model, which is by Luke and Freebody. So if you are having any problems with understanding this, they do align. So our first part of the operational dimension links to the code breaker or to the text decoder element of the 4 resources model. So when we're thinking about just the really basics of language, being actually able to read, being actually able to decipher and to decode the actual words on the page. Even if we think back to that other model that we looked at with the general capabilities of English, we can see that that grammar knowledge falls under that operational dimension. It talks about kids being able to understand the words, being able to decode and understand that different language resources needed for different types of text, such as visual images. So it's really that how-to knowledge. It's really the mechanical aspects of literacy. It's the bare bones. It's the decoding the words on a page, the very basics of reading, and then writing, the bare basics of writing. The cultural dimension aligns with that text user and text participant part of the 4 resources model. And that's really talking about that all language and all of our, literacy being that socio-cultural construct, the fact that we engage in language as a part of oral language and being able to communicate, and that reading and writing fall into that part of communication, and that different pieces of writing have different purposes, different pieces of writing have different audiences, and we write to fulfill that need. We read with different stances. We come to literacy, we come to reading from a different viewpoint depending on what our previous experiences are, depending on what our lived experiences are. So in the cultural dimension, it's focusing on that meaning making. It's really focusing on that ability to comprehend what it is that you're reading, and that literacy has that social context. Literacy has that social blend to it. We don't have just reading and writing in isolation from each other. We understand that it's all part of a social construct, and that children will bring their own experiences to what it is that they're reading, and then from there, you form your own bias. We have the critical dimension, which obviously aligns with that critical text analysis part of the 4 resources model, and that's really getting kids to really reflect on, question and interrogating views and beliefs embedded in text, and activities that challenge taken for granted assumptions about text. So from the cultural element, you will have assumptions that you will bring to a text depending on what your lived experiences are. From there, you need to be able to be critical. You need to be able to really think about what your own potential biases are. You need to think critically about what the author's potential biases are. You need to think critically about the credibility of the information that you're reading, the credibility of particular websites and sources. So you can see here that this top operational element is the bare bones reading and writing. This cultural element is all of the other factors, beliefs in the world, politics, all of these different cultural factors, your family, everything that's influenced you and your lived experiences have an effect on how you read and what you read and how you process what you read. And then you need to think critically about where these social and these social constructs come from and how they influence you as a reader. You're going to define each of those, and then you are going to link them to the scenario. So we can already see in our scenario that kids need to be able to decode and comprehend text. That's something that they're going to have to do in this science inquiry unit. They're going to have to understand critically, be able to critically analyze some of these texts. They're going to have to use science-based vocab to understand new words. They're going to have to write procedures. They might have to make connections to their own experiences. So in the science unit, the kids are going to be doing a lot of these things that's in the operational model. And you need to give some examples of where you can see them. How can you relate what you know about the 3D model to science and Sean's particular content descriptor that he needs to teach? What are the operational demands? What are the bare bones basic literacy skills that kids need? What are the cultural or socio-cultural aspects that will influence what kids do within that particular CD? If you have to predict, what kind of skills does that require? Does that influence the cultural aspect of that particular CD? How does the critical part of that affect if you are doing, say, experiments where you need to be testing theories? How does the critical demand impact on that? We will talk more about this and give you some more brainstorming time in our interactive collab, but I hope that's enough to get you started, person 2. Now, person 3, you are going to really focus on informal and formal literacy. So again, like person 2 or person B, you're going to need to be able to define it, and that's going to take up quite a big portion of your word count as well. So you're going to really focus on something like informal literacy is an approach to literacy learning where activities are spontaneous and often unplanned. Informal learning promotes hands-on experiences which are directed by the learner and found to be an effective method in developing and retaining knowledge. Then you'll go on to talk about formal literacy. I have brainstormed some things that I imagine it to be. So we've got informal literacy on this side, really being that spontaneous, unplanned. This is literacy learning that's happening not in a literacy session. It's literacy learning being implemented and guided by what's happening with the kids. So I've got key terms, and again, this is not an exhaustive list and you don't need to mention all of these. I'm just trying to get you started. It's spontaneous, it's hands-on, it's learner-directed. There is no formal literacy assessment involved. There are discussions. I've got pay-based, but that's probably a little bit early childhood. I'd probably go just connect back with the inquiry-based, but you get what I mean. Informal is really that formal literacy is really that literacy block. When we think about those first 2 hours in the morning, it is organized, planned, structured literacy tasks, which will have very, very specific literacy learning intentions and literacy success criteria. It's very structured, and the teacher knows exactly what they want the kids to be getting out of that session. There is formal pre-testing so that we know where we're going to be taking the kids. There is formal literacy assessment. It also works to a very specific formula or a very specific pedagogy. So if we were using, say, the workshop model, we would know that we're going to have, say, a whole class tuning in with a particular learning intention. and then kids would be breaking off into perhaps like a guided reading, and then the other kids would be doing independent reading, and then we'd come back and have a reflection from that whole part whole. So literacy is planned. Literacy has a particular formal pedagogical approach being used. It has formal assessment. It is a formal literacy lesson that we would do in that 2-hour block. Informal is happening incidentally. During maths, we are using reading and writing, but we're not teaching the kids particular content descriptors. This is where we use, hopefully, if we've done formal literacy really well, kids can use the skills that they've learnt in their formal literacy lessons to then be able to show you how they can use them in an informal setting. And often you get some really good insight into how kids can use, how kids can comprehend, how kids can engage with text, how kids can research through these inquiry-based units, because you have to implement the skills you've learned. It's one thing to be doing it in a formal literacy setting with the teacher support and perhaps a lot of reinforcement and templates and scaffolding, but can you do it in an informal setting in a science lesson where you have to go off and research about a particular thing? Can you manage to do that? And if we link it back to the scenario, it's very interesting in terms of Sean explaining that, his team, the students in his cohort are quite low, which means that they may not feel very comfortable in implementing a lot of the literacy skills that they do have in an informal setting, because there's just not that same support and scaffolding and sort of mentorship from the teacher that you would expect in a formal literacy lesson. So how can this be used to improve Sean and his team's teaching? Where can we find evidence of this in the scenario? So we want to have a look at informal literacy in particular, because that's a majority of what it's going to be in this inquiry unit. And how can Sean improve his teaching? How can he maybe use some of these things to improve the lessons that he's going to plan? So maybe you need to do a little bit of research into what a really excellent inquiry would look like and how it can support literacy. Maybe you suggest that things are hands-on and learner directed, and that there's an opportunity for lots of discussions. We will give you some more support around this when we come to the interactive collab, but remember, person C needs to define informal and formal literacy using lots of academic references for support, and then you're going to just relate it back to how using an informal literacy approach could be beneficial in a scenario like this to support students' learning, and also remembering that he's got a really diverse and complex class, and how having informal literacy could perhaps nurture some of those struggling students, to help them in those sort of group discussions with other kids, maybe mixing them up. Learner directed maybe is the motivation they need. Think about those low learners and how you could really motivate them to want to learn more about the topic. If they're seeing lots of hands-on activities, that might spur them on to want to read. This is a team assessment, as I'm sure that you've already figured out, and there's a few things that you need to agree upon really early. Just remember, if you're a specialisation student, you need to be with other specialisation students, please. You need to submit one. Everyone will submit so that you all have a link in Turnitin and a link in Grade Centre, but all three of you will be submitting the same task, and you will all get the same grade. But things to agree upon early. Maybe you think about how you could communicate and collaborate. What's good for you? You have to decide on, are you going to go through Google Docs? Are you going to have a chat over the phone? Are you going to Zoom? Whatever it is going to use. How often are you going to meet? When are you going to meet? How are you going to finalise the assignment? My silly slide just moved again. And a most important thing is that you also need to have some sort of evidence in your submission. So as a as an appendix in your actual assessment itself. As a screenshot, you can give access to your ELA to a Google Doc that they can have a look at. There was some links in Canvas. I'm not sure if they're still there. A link to a discussion board post. If you'd like, you can have a look in there too. My thinking is that a Google Doc or some sort of appendix is probably the most easiest and straightforward thing to do. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that's helped just to get you started for your different assessments, and I'll see you in the interactive collab.